topic is Brown versus the Board of Education and segregation in public education in the South. And our guests are Ms. LWynn and Dr. LBaldwin. Dr. Baldwin, let's see if we can end this final segment by having you to give us some information relative to segregation in higher education in the South. And of course, Ms. Wynn will end it by supplementing some of the information that you're dealing with.
As Mrs. Wynn pointed out, the Plessy v. Ferguson case sort of established segregation across the board, not just in transportation, but in schools, etc. As early as the 1930s, the NAACP was interested in fighting for the implementation of equal education at the higher levels of institutions. It started in the 1930s, and of course, 1954 Brown v. Board of Education was sort of a culmination of much of what had happened since that time, the 1930s. But the impact of that decision on higher education was not great in the first 10 years. Studies showed that, in the first place, the decision had to do more with public education than with private education. And most of my career, I've been associated with private institutions, interestingly enough. But when you look at public institutions, you don't see a great impact of the decision on those institutions, particularly in the South, largely because of the resistance and defiance that I talked about earlier. Some statistics show that if you're looking at the period from 1955 up to 1965, for an example, that the implementation of the decision occurred on a level of about slightly more than 2% in the southern states. But when you get to the border states, you get a higher percentage. But I think there was the feeling in the South, has long been the feeling in the South, that the federal government is trying to impose something on educational institutions. And I think that accounts in large measure for the kind of resistance and defiance that went on. But my experience has been, if you want to look at my experience, I've noticed over the years that desegregation or integration, if you want to use another term, has really not occurred on any grand scale since the Brown v. Board of Education, primarily because we haven't had the proper resources allocated, particularly financial resources. It's very, very important. Also, I think we have misunderstood the meaning of integration. Integration has to do not only with it has to do with mutual acceptance, not just rubbing shoulders and elbows. It has to do with mutual acceptance. It has to do with interpersonal, intergroup living, and shared power and resources. And I think that's the problem. That's where we've fallen short in terms of the allocation of proper resources to implement these decisions that have been passed down from the levels of the courts.
Would you agree with that the implementation has been sort of stymied because of available resources?
I think the implementation was stymied because of resources. Also, right after Brown v. Board passed, you can't forget about the Southern Manifesto, which was signed by almost all of the Southern senators and representatives, with the exception of the senators and representatives in Tennessee, Albert Gore, Percy Priest, and there was another one I can't call his name right off the top of my head, but they did not sign the Southern Manifesto, which makes Tennessee a little unique in that respect. Dr.
Why don't you explain what the Southern Manifesto was?
Well, the Southern Manifesto was a group of Southern congresspersons coming together and vehemently opposing the decision of Brown versus Board of Education. So, that's basically, they were willing to fight Brown v. Board. And you see that later with George Wallace and several other people, governmental officials in the South, and especially the Deep South. They were not going to desegregate their schools. Dr. Baldwin used the term integrate. I use the term desegregate because I think integration applies assimilation. And I do not believe that the civil rights movement, beginning with Brown versus Board, was about assimilation. It was about choice. African Americans were denied the right of choice. So it really didn't have anything to do with people who look like me wanting to be assimilated into mainstream society. It was about a choice. If I want to go to that to Vanderbilt University. Do not deny me because I happen to have more melanin in my skin than you do.
That's true.
So I use the word desegregation as opposed to integration.
Yeah, but I don't see it as assimilation so much. When I say integration, I know assimilation means taking on the values of the larger culture. Integration for me means mutual acceptance. It means having the right to be educated in the same environment. It means sharing power and resources. But I think assimilation would be a more of an extreme form of integration.
But I think when we look at the desegregation process post-Brown v. Board, what you find is that most schools that were in African American communities were either closed or absorbed, and you lost touch with your community base.
That's true. That's true.
And so that's the reason, you know, I say, you know, it's assimilation. It seems as though to me, you know, based on, you know, what I actually experienced and what I have studied, is that anything that was black was almost closed, which to me implies assimilation.
It really didn't matter about the quality of what was going on.
Didn't matter about the quality.
It was just
you know,
that the two had to come together.
And you know, when we look at Brown v. Board and you look at some of the new materials that have come out, look at Derek Bell's book, Silent Covenants.
Yes, yes.
You know, he mentions the fact that post-Brown v. Board, prior to that, black Americans did not view themselves as a race that was in turmoil and conflict. Post-Brown v. Board, especially in the last 20 years, we have heard, you know, things about the African American community, the disintegration of the family.
Oh, sure.
And you know, I tend to agree with Bell's thesis. Maybe the court should have focused on the equal, as opposed, you know, putting the separate and equal really, and making it equal.
Yeah. But see, shared power is needed to do that.
Right, and I agree that shared power is very much needed.
Yeah.
But, and if you look at Charles Ogletree's book, With All Deliberate Speed, you know, it's very interesting what the court did in the 1955 decision.
Good.
Because
Brown
in the
too.
Brown 2, because they inserted the words with all deliberate speed,
That's right.
which gave the South the opportunity to do what? To take it as slowly as it wanted to. And I mean, again, when you speak about Nashville and its public educational system, we just ended a case in Nashville not too long ago. This started in 1955.
Exactly.
And it ended in the 90s. I mean, that's all deliberate speed.
Yeah, well,
And that case, you know, the Nashville model became the model for cities across the South.
I think there was a lot of fear that if you pushed the South too fast on this issue, that they wouldn't conform to court decisions. So there was always some reluctance on the part of the Supreme Court to sort of dictate and demand, to say that we're trying to persuade and mediate, not dictate and demand, because they understood that the white South could be very resistant when you're dealing with these kinds of issues.
Well, you know, I'll give them, you know, credit for one thing. I think that when you look at American history in general, and you look at world history and what was going on, you were in the middle of a Cold War period, okay? Brown v. Board, I think, helped at least the image of America internationally. You know, internationally, how can you be talking about democracy abroad when you have a group of your citizens who are not receiving democracy in their own land? This, you know, is a country that was built upon the blood, sweat, tears of people of African descent. So, you know, I think it helped there. And certainly when you look at that 10-year span between 54 and 64, with the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 64, the Voting Rights Act of 65, and the Housing Act of 68, all of that helped within that Cold War period. So, you know, I think the Civil Rights Movement helped propel national policy that made America look better in the eyes of the world.
Very good.
That's true.
Very good. And of course, Dr. Baldwin, we've got about 45 seconds.
Yeah, I agree wholeheartely with that. Growing up in the South, I saw how the white South responded. They really didn't care how the world portrayed America. And people like George Wallace and Lester Maddox often said, Why should we care about
Eastland
how
out
the
of
world
Mississippi.
view us? We're feeding
We
half
have
of
some,
them.
You know,
yeah.
So why should they?
As a matter of fact, during these last 20 seconds here, let me simply say that in my own career, I can remember seeing these large signs as we passed through
White
the state
in
of
color.
Virginia on Earl Warren, impeach Chief Justice Earl Warren.
Yeah.
And of course, I think that indicated that the South was essentially against this decision. And of course, let me encourage our audience to tune in again next week for another informative edition of Comments with Dr. James Haney, where we will again talk about the issue of Brown versus the Board of Education.